it's my honour to introduce one of Australia's most dauntless female leaders, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek MP, Member for Sydney and Shadow Minister for Education and Training, to officially open our forum, Revisiting the Revolution, Whitlam and Women. Thank you, Tanya.
Well, thank you so much, Leanne, and what a pleasure it is to be here with so many friends today. I want to start by thanking Auntie Violet for that very warm and generous welcome to country, and also pay my respects to elders past and present of the Ngunnawal people. Leanne just mentioned the Mexico City Women's Conference in 1975, and imagining what it's like to be part of one of those delegations. I was part of a similar delegation in 2009 to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, and one of the best things we did on that trip was invite the women from Fitzroy Crossing to show their film, Yajilara, in the annex of the United Nations building. It was standing room only. In fact, there were people sitting on the stairs in that theaterette, desperate to see this story from remote Australian community that had taken its future into its own hands. And I was so proud to be part of that delegation with those magnificent women telling their story to the world. So we can tell our stories to the world when we get the chance to do so. I want to acknowledge the marvellous Catherine Dovey, the Honourable John Faulkner, Patricia Amplet, Gabby Traynor, the Honourable Penny Wensley, the Honourable Susan Ryan, the Honourable Elizabeth Evatt, Dr Elizabeth Reid, Mari Coleman, Kate Carnell, Major General Liz Cosson, Daryl Karp, Dr Helen Watchers, Emeritus Professor Marion Sawyer, Wendy McCarthy, Margaret Reynolds, Mari Coleman. I keep looking around the room going, uh-oh, I'm going to leave someone out. It's fantastic to see all of you. Let's just say that, okay? And it's such a great pleasure to be invited to open this conference to talk about Gough Whitlam's legacy and the lessons that we can draw from his government. I want to start with two lessons. The first is that governments must be brave and bold, and secondly, that governments must be practical and in touch with the daily needs of the people that they seek to represent. I think Gough showed us that you can sue a Western Sydney and buy blue poles and be part of the one government. Real change takes more than good intentions. The Whitlam government's reforms took years of hard, detailed policy work, and much of that was in the long, cold years of opposition. Much of it was in partnership with those who would be directly affected. Or as we say today, nothing about us without us. The work on women's policy was done by feminists inside the Labor Party in concert with feminists outside the Labor Party. It won't surprise anybody in this room to know that the Labor Party of the 1960s and the 1970s, well, the embrace of feminism in those days was tenuous. I'm hearing bids from the audience now. I was going to say not unanimous. Feminist activists, including many in the Labor movement, worked through organisations like the Women's Electoral Lobby to get issues onto the policy agenda. And of course, WELL is still going strong, and in my state of New South Wales has just been a very important force in the long overdue decriminalisation of abortion. So I describe these women as feminist activists, but I guess in the language of the day, they would have described themselves as members of the women's liberation movement. The reforms they advocated and then in government helped deliver had liberation at their core, freedom at their core. Freedom to have and raise a child without being thrown into poverty with the supporting mother's benefit. Freedom to choose not to get pregnant by listing the contraceptive pill on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme so women could exercise choice, whatever their means. Greater freedom to leave an unhappy or a violent marriage with funding to women's refuges, the introduction of no-fault divorce and rape crisis centres. Freedom from a lifetime of being underpaid or excluded from the workforce, because you can't be free if you need pocket money from your father to spend or permission from your husband to borrow. You can't be free if you don't have the option to earn enough to support yourself. We may still be striving to close the gender pay gap, but the first steps were taken when Gough reopened the equal pay case. 500,000 female workers became eligible for full pay, and women's wages overall rose by around 30%. For the first time under the Whitlam government, women became entitled to the minimum wage. For the first time, Commonwealth public servants became formally entitled to maternity leave. And ask any working parent about the importance of the Whitlam government's support for childcare. It may be hard to imagine now, but these liberating policies were bold, they were brave, they were also a little controversial. Each of them had a real and practical impact, a meaningful impact on the everyday lives of Australian women. What seemed radical at the time strikes us as common sense today. But it wasn't just the so-called women's policies that changed women's lives. All policies affect women. Almost all policies affect women and men differently. The Whitlam government understood that. Elizabeth Reid, as advisor to Gough Whitlam, made the argument that all policies should be assessed for their impact on women. Working for Bob Hawke, Anne Summers developed the Women's Budget Statement, and when I was Minister for Women, I used these examples of gender-responsive budgeting. Our cabinet documents all included gender impact statements, and just recently when we were in opposition, I had the Women's Portfolio, all our shadow cabinet documents included women's gender impact statements. We committed to gender-responsive budgeting, recommitted in the last term that all of our budgeting would reflect the best practice of gender-responsive budgeting. Because you can't tackle structural entrenched disadvantage just through targeted women's programs. It takes broad economic reform that suits women. I'll never forget the way that sometimes if I met Gough for a cup of coffee and we'd be walking down the street or I'd be walking him to the car, people would stop and thank him for the impact that he had had on their lives. And so often they were thanking him for the opportunity to go to university. I'm sure there were people in this room who feel the same way. But when Gough spoke about his legacy himself, he often said that the men stopped him to thank him for ending conscription, the women stopped him to thank him for the chance to go to university. Opening up universities and technical colleges to everyone wasn't one of the Whitlam government's women's policies, but the main beneficiary of the policy were women. In the 3 years of the government, participation in higher education increased by 25%. A generation of women and working class men were freed to make the most of their abilities. Like my family, working class migrants, we just never could have afforded to send my brothers and I to university if the old system had remained. Not a chance. Education has lifelong and life-changing effects. The reforms changed the lives of those who can continue their education for the first time, but they didn't just affect the lives of those who had the opportunity to go to university otherwise wouldn't have. It affected the lives of their children, and I think we can say their grandchildren. These impacts are intergenerational in giving opportunity and reducing inequality in our country. When all Australians have the opportunity to reach their full potential, our whole country is better, smarter and stronger. I'm very pleased to have the education portfolio now. And I was also so proud when I had the health portfolio in government of the legacy that I was part of, defending and extending the legacy of Labor heroes like Doug Everingham, Neil Blewett and Brian Howe. The Whitlam government's creation of Medibank, what became Medicare, was another incredibly bold reform. It transformed Australia's health system and had life-changing effects for Australian women. Again, not specifically badged as a women's policy, but of course the greatest beneficiaries are women. Before Medibank, Australians who couldn't afford private insurance were often locked out of the health care they needed or bankrupted if they sought out the health care they needed. Many in the fast-growing outer suburbs travelled hours to get the care that they needed if they became sick. When the Whitlam government created Medibank, many Australians got health care within their reach for the very first time, funding new hospitals, the community health program, putting health care in the expanding suburbs where people lived. When we talk about the Whitlam government's legacy for Australian women, the idea of universal access to healthcare through Medibank has to be included. It meant screening for breast cancer, for cervical cancer. It meant vaccination programs that have made rubella a thing of the past. It means prenatal and postnatal care that are now a norm and not a luxury. The Whitlam government's focus on the suburbs, just before I move on, I have to say these are a norm, but not for all Australian women in all places. And this is just a reminder again that you can't take any of these things for granted. We can't take them for granted because there are still gaps in our universal provision. The Whitlam government's focus on the suburbs where so many young families lived went beyond healthcare. As Neville Rand said, Gough found the outer suburbs of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane unsewered and he left them fully flushed. And we never ever forget the impact of Margaret Whitlam's practical wisdom. I don't know if you've all seen this bag. I'm doing a little promo for the Whitlam Institute's stuff you can buy here. I'm a feminist insofar as I don't want to be trodden on and I don't want to be used as somebody's handbag. I'm not an accessory, said Margaret. My Sydney Federal Electorate Council have named our annual dinner and speech in Margaret Whitlam's name because we are very good at honouring Gough's legacy, and Margaret was such a driving force in Australian politics of her time. We wanted to make sure that Margaret's contribution was also recognised. She lived in Cabramatta with a young family. She knew that there were concrete, achievable changes that would make huge differences in the lives of women like her. Local swimming pools, public libraries. She was an absolutely tireless advocate for those things that some people think of as small, but are so important, the services and the programs that so many Australian women and their families needed for a decent quality of life. And so I finish on this third lesson that I want to draw out about the Whitlam legacy. Even when reforms have been carefully, painfully won, they can never be taken for granted. Today we have Medicare, not Medibank. You all know why. You know what happened when the Fraser government came in. Since then, we have seen Medicare under attack again and again. Today, we have bigger out-of-pocket expenses than any time in the history of Medicare. We've got longer waiting lists in hospitals. It is something that we need to protect and defend. 2013 was the last time that Australia had a women's budget statement. The gender pay gap remains stubbornly high, and the really bad news is that in recent years we've fallen from 15th on the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap list to 39th. How do we let that happen? How do we let that happen? We have to build on the achievements of our predecessors, but we can never take those earlier gains for granted. Medicare came from Medibank. Medibank came from the Curtin and Chifley government's healthcare reforms. We always have to both defend and extend the victories won in the past. Gough himself described the purpose of the Whitlam Institute as, and I quote, to help the great and continuing work of building a more equal, open, tolerant and independent Australia. I'd like to think that all of us can play a role in achieving that goal for the men and women of Australia. Thank you.